to the Flix Forum podcast, where each episode we go back and we look at a Netflix original film in the order of release. Today we have Netflix 363rd film from 2021. It's the French biographical film called Madame Claude. This one is directed by Sylvie Verheyde and stars Karole Rocher. I'm Jesse and I am your host as always. Thank you for joining me today for this episode. As always, if you haven't seen this film and you're interested in checking it out, give us a pause and come back a little bit later on because we will spoil this as we go. And we start the show with the Fast Flicks, where we do a quick little summary of what the film is all about. So this one is about the rise and fall of Madame Claude's prostitution empire. Yes, this is based on the truth, based on history, based on something that happened in France. And I guess maybe this is a bit of a big story or something that people in France would know about. I'd never heard of Madame Claude or this story. So we're going to talk about this film, and yeah, I've already said spoiler, so let's get into it. What did we learn, or what could I find out about this film? It is an international film, and it was very hard to find anything out about how this one ended up on Netflix. Well, I could find out that this is based on the true life of Fernande Grudu, my French is not great, who was also known as Madame Claude. So there is a 1977 film of the same name, which is, this film covers the same sort of story. It's obviously her life. You can't change her life too much. This was filmed in and around Paris and other parts of France during May of 2019. It did hit Netflix worldwide on the 2nd of April 2021, and around the world. What else is it called? So Madame Claude obviously is the title of our character. It's pretty much the same everywhere, except in Portuguese it's called Madame Claude's Secrets, so it adds a little bit of intrigue to the title. In Japanese it's called Legend of the Night, Madame Claude, so plays on that idea of the I guess her title and how well known she may be. Not for me though, because this is new for me. So what are the critics and audiences saying about this film? On Rotten Tomatoes it sits at 20%. That is rotten. That's only on 5 reviews though, so not very positive. Audience on Rotten Tomatoes is only a little bit higher. It sits at 30%. That's on less than 50 ratings, so also not very good. IMDb, it's a little bit higher. It sits at a 5.4 out of 10 on 4,200 ratings. Letterboxd sits at a 2.8 out of 5 on 5,279 ratings and has been logged by nearly 8,000 people. So I'd say for a French, like often French films, they're seen by a few people. This one doesn't seem to have hit the mark, I guess, with critics. Audiences a little bit higher at stages, but what are my early thoughts on this film? I think it does struggle a bit from pacing and almost an over-reliance on shots of dancing and smoking cigarettes and sex and nudity. However, it does look so good throughout, and it's performed very well. So I've got to give it credit where it's due, I think. Like, it's not an absolutely horrendous film. Yes, it drags. It could be a little bit tighter, but I was interested. I was intrigued with this character that I knew nothing about realistically. And I guess if you know this character and know her life and her story, maybe it is a little bit boring because it probably just goes through the plot points of her life. And for me, I guess new character, new story. So that's maybe why I liked it a little bit more. Let's talk about the character. So Madame Claude, the film is named after her. She is I guess I'd call her a doting mother, but also ruthless pimp to her work family, to the girls that she works with. They're not her clients, they are her family, and that's where she spends her time, her dedication. She, like I said, she's ruthless, she's harsh, she's hard, but she wants cash, and she wants the girls that work for her to better themselves. And she's created this wealth and fame for herself after coming from nothing herself. You know, she had no family. A goat was her best friend, these types of things. She's obviously done the hard yards and is supporting these others or her family to break free in this world that she knows how to. But this also means that she's absent to her own daughter, who she had, who literally wants nothing to do with her. She's dumped her with her own mother, and they want nothing to do with her pretty much as well. She's ambitious. She's resentful for the life that men have in France, and this maybe plays a part in why she says that she has no time for men. She has no time for love. However, when love or an interest does come along in this character, Andre, you can probably understand why she's so ruthless in getting rid of him, and especially when he lets her down as well. Sidoni, this is the side character, I guess. This is a middle-class daughter of a French minister who insists on working for Madame Claude because she believes her insight is valuable amongst the upper class and her friends. And Claude trains her as her prodigy almost, and pushes, Sidoni pushes the idea to Claude that because of her upbringing, she doesn't have to waste time on her, training her, teaching her how to clean herself, these types of things. She's a complicated character, almost the most interesting character in this film, because she clearly loves Madame Claude, but also gets close to other characters throughout the film. We see she has a bit of a toy boy at one stage, this Joe Attia character who's a bit of a gangster. She gets close to him, and I think that she jumps whenever she can to impress Madame Claude, and that sort of shows. And we see this at the end of the film, how much Madame Claude means to her, and I think she mentions, you're the only person I've ever truly loved. So very interesting character for me, Sidone. I mentioned Joe Attia. He's this gangster who works alongside Madame Claude. He helps her do her dodgy work while also taking a bit of a cut for himself. And the sad thing, I guess, with him is that once it gets all too much, Madame Claude, it's closing in on her. The forces and the law, they're all getting closer to her. He can't support her anymore. He can't look out for her anymore. And a part of that too is that he's unwell himself, and he's almost on his deathbed too. Serge, he's this police officer. He's happy to have his team use Madame Claude and her services and her girls, but he's also happy to see her downfall too. I'm going to mention Virginie. She's probably the most tragic character in the film. She's set up for failure. She's sent to abusive men and unfortunately sent out at one stage and never returns, with very little follow-up or care from anyone about where she is. It's just like, yeah, we'll find her, and that's almost it. And that's a little bit sad, and I guess they needed one character in this film to sort of show the really bad side of this industry and what can happen if checks and balances aren't in place to ensure the safety and the well-being of not only staff, but those that work here too. I did mention Andre before, Madame Claude's partner. He's her boyfriend for a large chunk of this film, and he does end up cheating on her with one of her girls, which infuriates her. He possibly felt that, or maybe he was longing for connection with someone because he felt that he could never get close to Madame Claude because she doesn't really open up to him. Even when he pries or pushes the question, he literally knows nothing about her, and I can probably understand why that's so frustrating, but that also adds that context to another male character in this world and society that she can't trust or who has let her down as well. The director, Sylvie Verheyde, 13 directing credits, a range of shorts, TV, film, all in French. I doubt I'm going to cover anything else from this director again, but I mean, I really like the visual style of this film. I did mention before. Talk about some scenes. What are some scenes that stood out? What were some scenes that didn't necessarily work for me? I did like, there's a scene where Madame Claude confronts Andre about cheating on her, and she just absolutely loses it. She throws things around the room, she smashes things up, and claiming that, he's only with her for the money. And his response is sort of, I understand why your mother and your daughter left you. He can see her in that moment as to how cruel she can be. And all this time, while she's going absolutely nuts, he sits there calmly in the room and just keeps saying, I love you, I love you. It was humorous and nice. I liked that moment too. Sidone, there's a moment where she sits down, and I think it's with Joe Attia, the gangster, contemplating having this hit put out on her father for the pain that he's caused her. And he's obviously high ranked in the French ministry or the government, and it's just an interesting thing to contemplate. And the follow-up is that she does eventually go and meet with her dad, and she sits down with him and has a meal and says that she's considered having a hit put on him, like having him murdered, and he calls her a whore and a coward. And this is enough for her. She just gets up, she smashes his head, smashes the plates, and walks out. I thought that was a really impactful moment. And finally, the final scene of the film was just so well done. Madame Claude, she's old, she's done her time. She's living the beachside in Nice, I think it was, and she's sitting by the ocean on this park bench, and these young people, a couple of girls, a couple of boys come by. They sit on the bench behind her. She's talking about she's got no complaints of life. She'll just wait for death to come for her. Just such clever camera work with these young people, especially the girls, almost like this male gaze that goes on them from the point of view of Madame Claude, where she's looking them up, and it makes the audience aware that she's thinking in her past life what she could have done with these girls. I just thought that was super clever and a really clever way to end the film too. What are some things that didn't work in this one for me? I think there's scenes with and this happens a lot in the film, like the girls that work for Madame Claude, they sit around, they talk, they smoke, they drink, they dance. There's this one scene where they're sitting around talking about all the famous people that they've been with, like JFK, and there's mention about being covered in sperm, and there's this gay guy there as well, and they have this pillow fight. It just felt not needed. I don't know why they needed to add that scene. There's a scene again where her girls, Madame Claude's girls, they're singing Christmas carols at this party, and prior to that, Madame Claude is dancing around her room to White Christmas, the carol. What's the need of this? Why did the audience need to know it was Christmas? It just didn't make sense. It was just annoying and just added further to the runtime of this film. And towards the end, Madame Claude, we see that she's very removed from her daughter's life, and the daughter wants nothing to do with her. And there's a moment where the daughter comes and sits with her in her car to tell her, I'm pregnant and you're going to be a grandmother. Madame Claude has a go at her for not telling her, and she's like, well, you keep changing addresses. I wanted to tell you, but I couldn't. And there's this quip from Madame Claude about, well, I hope it's a boy so he doesn't have to live a poor life. And the daughter just storms off. I just didn't think it was a very good scene. Not needed. We got that she was very distant from her daughter and her mother. I don't know. It didn't really wrap anything up for me. Anyway, themes, ideas. What's this film trying to say? There's quite a bit in it. Obviously, the idea of power, the power that you can have through corruption, through politicians, through the police force, and that fine line between crime and that idea of, scratch my back and I'll scratch yours. And we see this through Madame Claude as well. She's been told her whole life that she can't be successful, but she also finds her own way to do it, which she's very proud of almost as well. But in saying that, there's that deep loneliness and vulnerability of a woman who's fighting for a place in this male-dominated society, especially in Paris and in France at the time, with that idea of female emancipation. And Sidonie believes that things are changing, and that gets shoved back in her face, which is quite sad. And Madame Claude mentions that idea of using her body or females' bodies as a weapon to fight against this toxic, sexist environment in Paris, because men decide what happens and they have the power, and Madame Claude does believe that this is unchangeable. Family plays a big role for Madame Claude through the girls that work for her as well, because we do see that blood relatives, they can be harsh, they can be cruel, they can be a letdown. We see that through Sidonie's father. We see that through Madame Claude mentions the trauma that she's experienced as a child too. So that idea that you can make your own family and make them who they are and spoil them yourselves and give them gifts yourselves and things like that. Love plays a big part too, that idea of opening yourself up to it and then being able to deal with the after effects when it does go wrong, because love, it can be a disease. And finally, happiness for Madame Claude in this film. Happiness to her is the most important thing. That idea of her not having to depend on people. The money obviously helps a little bit with that too, but she also understands that happiness never lasts that long too, and I guess is a little bit accepting of the punishment and consequences that she does face at the end of the film. What did I take away from this one? I think I'll probably touch on this in the scenes as well, but there is way too much dancing and singing and random scenes of flesh and nudity that didn't really add anything to the film. They do a good job in the scenes of Madame Claude's girls with the men to sort of highlight the idea that this is a job, this isn't enjoyable for them. I get those scenes, but there's just so many other scenes in clubs and dancing. This film should have been a tight 90 minutes. There's no need for this to nearly run for 2 hours, and it would have probably been a much better film. We have a segment where we say, hey, did we jump on IMDb to check any of the cast out? This is, I'm breaking the rules a little bit. I jumped on Google because I needed to look something up. There are so many underworld characters in the film. I only mentioned almost Joe Adia in this one, but there's all these other ones that are featured who are never really given any introduction, and I found it really hard to follow who they are and what role they played, and possibly they're big names in France and people would understand that, but there's constant reference in this film to the Markovic affair. And I had to look it up, and the information, like, this gave me a little bit more of a background, I guess, into who the characters were and why that was a constant running theme throughout the film. Because the Markovic affair, it was this political scandal in France in 1968 and these are some of the characters that we saw in the film, but it followed the violent death of Stefan Markovic, who was a friend and bodyguard of an actor called Alain Delon. The media and the press, they speculated that Delon was involved. So Delon's longtime friend and gangster friend which was Francois Marcontoni, who we see in this film too, was arrested, which we see in the film too, but was bailed out in 1969. And there was a little bit of a mention of that he got let out as well. This whole affair was never solved, and it was dismissed in 1973 for the lack of evidence, and to this day it still remains unsolved. But there's been like further developments, which we see mentioned in this film too, of sexually explicit photos that allege Claude Pompidou, who was the wife of the French president Georges Pompidou, was found in Markovic's car after his death, and a former police chief, Lucien Aimé Blanc, who was pointed as being responsible for recovering the photos, stated that they had been planted by established clans who were opposed to the president. So a little bit of interesting context that if I lived in France and knew this scandal, this film, and I wouldn't have had to fill in those gaps. So I think that's an interesting little thing. Sometimes a film is made for the local audience, and for me, not understanding that's probably some missing gaps for me as well. Some questions, some pondering, some ideas. I've got one sort of thought. I think that the idea of this film, it like I sort of just touched on there, it has all these underlying things that someone who doesn't live in France wouldn't get the context of. So this film, could it have worked better if it just focused on the relationship between Madame Claude and Sidonie? I think that this could have been a really good character piece between the two, that the love that they felt for each other throughout, and the building of their empire together and the work that they did together. And unfortunately, it does at times turn into this mishmash of characters. So yeah, just an observation from me. All right, I'm ready to wrap this up. We do give the film a rating out of 5 on this show. For me, like, I still was immersed in this world that the film created, because the sets, the designs, the period stylistic choices, the soundtrack, it was all mesmerizing and engaging for me, and I really enjoyed that. The performances too, they worked really well. In saying that, this isn't an excellent biopic, but it's a decent one that still had me engaged, and obviously enough for me to want to look up what some of these references were about. So I'm giving this a 3 out of 5. That's still a solid score for me. We're on socials. We have Instagram, we have Facebook, and we have X, formerly known as Twitter. Give us a like, give us a follow if you can. The question for this episode that I wanted to put on socials is like Paris. Have you ever visited Paris? Have you been a tourist in Paris? Do you live in Paris? I've been to Paris once, and I've got to say it was not enjoyable. I don't know, like, yes, we did all the touristy things. We climbed the Eiffel Tower. That was lovely. But in saying that, there were so many gypsies and homeless people around the bottom. You know, you do the tour, you see the Arc de Triomphe, and you go outside. I didn't go in the Louvre, but we saw the outside of the Louvre and those sorts of things. Beautiful. Went to the Moulin Rouge, all these sorts of things. But to me, I don't know, I just didn't feel like a city that I felt safe or was really mesmerized by. Whereas like London and other European cities, they really stand out. I don't know, maybe that's just me. What do you think of Paris? Let me know. Other than that, we are back next week. We do have another international film next week from 2021. It's the Turkish comedy drama called Have You Ever Seen Fireflies? Or in Turkish, it's Senhik Astabojik Gordon Mu. It's directed by Andak Hazagalu and stars Yilmaz Erdogan, Ekme Erke, and Engin Alkan. That's what we've got next week. I'm intrigued. I'm interested. We've done a few Turkish films now, so I'm interested to see how this one goes. Thanks for joining me. Hopefully you've enjoyed it. Hopefully you've seen the film and this made a bit of sense. If not, join us next week. Watch that film, and I'll see you then.